Stephen Pickard could not be here. I speak on his behalf, probably worse than he would have done because he was more involved with the actual construction of this book on the impact of education on character formation, ethics, and the communication of values in late modern pluralistic societies. The moment one looks at the theme, one would obviously expect a book on education because it is widely held that education, and in this specific book, school education at primary and secondary levels, play a crucial role in shaping society's future citizens. Education as a separate social system in contemporary late modern societies relates to all three of the Stände identified by Luther, family, church, and state, John, to which you referred earlier this morning. Most of first informal education, obviously we saw it in the beautiful presentation earlier about the brain development and the family. Informal education starts in the family, but there is a growing international and global movement to keep education in the family. Kind of homeschooling idea. In fact, where we live in Portugal, we've recently been joined by a number of families from Germany who moved there, and if you ask them, the reason is they say we would like to have the right to maintain the family as the primary educator of our children, even the academic side of that. For that, you can use the internet and other help. So the family and education is not only an informal, it's becoming a formal connection. Then the connection with the church, I can see from my colleagues from the chapters, especially those of you who work in the United States, that the whole idea that the state should not completely control the education system, but allow for a multiplicity of voices, specifically for schools that are non-governmental, and more specifically those who are from, say, specifically Christian or Jewish or Islamic character, should be allowed to exercise their right to contribute to education in the plural sense of the word. But when we come to the state, obviously the third area, by far the largest sets of institutional schools are hosted by the public school system. One might, I'm not sure, whether we could say we might even bring the market in. There's also a growing private school system that are for profit. And in that case, the school system also functions within the market. The volume in this impact series is again marked by a significant range of disciplines. In this specific book, there are people from education, theology, psychology, literature studies, anthropology, law, and business. Again, Michael showing the multiplicity of disciplines addressing the same problem but from different perspectives. Despite the wide-ranging perspectives, there are at least three assumptions shared by all the contributors. Now, this is my extraction. It's not in the book. First is that education, and specifically school education, is a major contributor to the formation of character and communication of values in late modern pluralistic societies. Second, despite this fairly easy-looking a shared assumption, school education is highly contested because it's the area of political power. If you influence the school system, you influence the future citizenry, and therefore it's a contested area. Third, it does present enormous potential to foster an environment conducive to the formation of character and shaping learners or students toward the broad ideals of a democratic order. This book ends with three chapters that try, and they are kind of thought experiments about how one could reconceptualize a school system. I bring him to the beginning now and say there are emerging themes that one might want to use to invigorate our current school education system to promote the kind of values that we would like to see in our citizenry in open and democratic societies. In the first contribution, Cunningham suggests that the language of vocation, which we as theologians know very well, or calling, be restored in the education system as depicting a meaningful or purposeful life. The ancient term vocation was already reinterpreted by Luther, as we know, beyond its narrow medieval clericalism to embrace a broad range of human occupations, including one's own and secular work. Whether you're a doctor, a teacher, a bricklayer, you are called to do that, and you do that obviously for the sake of a meaningful and purposeful life. By framing education as preparation for a vocation, not merely a job. Learners are imbued with the idea of work as a calling and a means of discernment to live a purposeful life. The second experimental thought from Irene Pieper links character formation with the potential of literature as a source and a mediator of the educational process. By reading the canon of good literature, a process of co-construction of identity takes place because literature has the potential to play a formative role in moral development. When I read this, I suddenly thought by myself, I have seen over the years how reading become less and less important for learners and students. The whole idea that one would read for a degree is really under threat. And when I read this about good literature, the question is, when will people read the literature, which is important. The reason for this sort of belief in the canon of good literature is that good literature takes a critical stance towards the existing order. It has the power to shape a situation towards a better outcome. An example from the German education system demonstrates that literature might contribute to moral development, to cultural continuity and identity formation. Not to mention the fact that good literature stimulates our imagination to think of a better world or greater justice than what we currently experience. I recently read a book on the link between management education, a world in which I have been living for a few years now, and the humanities. And one of the writers make a powerful argument that poetry is probably the most important way in which humanities and management sciences can come together because of the fact that it invigorates the imagination. And I hope with that also the moral imagination. This approach to literature education is perhaps illustrated by Anne Stewart. I'm not sure, is she in the audience, or I think Anne, yeah. Sorry, I put your chapter here. I'm not sure whether it's the right place, but there's my chance. And in her chapter on what has Solomon to do with Google, says that late modern societies, there's an overload of information. She coins the beautiful term an infodemic, which includes the spread of misinformation, as we just saw in Georgia and in the United States of America. Education is therefore, above all else, required to foster and enhance the quality of discernment amongst competing voices and truth. The book of Proverbs is exactly aimed at practical skills to navigate the world, equip those willing to heed its advice to live amid the difficult choices posed by moral discernment. Proverbs, a part of the biblical canon and also part of the cultural heritage of late modern societies, provides an example, I think, of literature education for wisdom, for discernment, and for seeking for the truth. Those of us who teach students know that the big question now is not to find information, it is to discern information. And for that you require a different kind of skill than merely to read. A third interesting suggestion about reinvigorating comes from Darcia Narvies. I'm not sure I pronounced the name correctly. She draws a sharp distinction between a taker culture and a leaver culture. The first, the taker culture, is known for its destruction of the natural environment because of the anthropocentric focus on human desires and needs beyond the carrying capacity of the ecological system. As we know, this is one of the great critiques of modern capitalism, that it has brought an anthropocentric focus on fulfillment of human needs without taking into account the price, as it were, of the environment. Moral education should therefore promote what she says a lever culture that fosters a nature-centered morality. For that, we might need to call on sustainable indigenous wisdoms, augmenting and critically questioning the current cultural and economic assumptions of our education philosophies. Taken together, these three proposals, reintegration or reinvigoration of the idea of vocatio or calling, literature as a base for education and moral formation, and also the idea of a nature-centered education, might help us to invigorate our system also in the moral sense of the word. Now I come to the second part of the book, and that is the question of contested spaces. I said earlier there are assumptions said. One is that specifically school education is absolutely essential, for the moral formation, and secondly, it is a contested area. And how this comes out is in the case studies. There are 5 case studies from 4 countries in this book, and each one of them illustrates in an interesting way different questions, although they all form part of what one can call late modern democracies. First, Heike Springart, who's also here today and will speak a bit more tomorrow, examines aspects of Germany's democratization after the Second World War. She highlights the role of education in shaping the national spirit of Germany in a time of significant transition. The comprehensive democratization process was fundamentally a re-education or pedagogic process. This is a very interesting observation. Democratization process after 1945 was in fact a re-education process, in which the church has played a key role. Religion is an important enabler of what Talcott Parsons called controlled institutional change. Religion is, by its nature, well positioned to provide answers to questions of meaning and purpose, and therefore provide some stabilizing continuity in the social systems, while at the same time playing a critical role against the anti-democratic and racist ideas like those prevalent in National Socialism. And may I say, Heike, when I read this, I also thought back on South Africa. May I remind the audience that South Africa only entered a truly modern, pluralist society on the 27th of April of 1994. I mean that in a formal sense. We never had an Enlightenment tradition behind us. We were a controlled, monocultural, oppressive society, and suddenly everything opens up. It's easy to say that. It's a very difficult re-education process to do that. I was at that stage involved in universities that were all white, and the next day we're open. How do you deal with that? It's a re-education process that I find very interesting. An interesting chapter by Joanne Reid from the School Education in Australia, I find also very interesting, because they are trying to change the education system from an Anglo-Saxon colonization idea with its inherent form of racism towards a school system that acknowledges a pluralist society and that promotes democratic values. That is now in Australia. She makes the valid point that schooling may well be the only shared social institution that young people participate in prior to exercising their rights as citizens. This is a very interesting point. Where do the intersections take place? In the school system. This makes the curriculum of that school system all the more important. Australia is faced with a major task to engage in the decolonization of the curriculum for the sake of educating the next generation of young Australians who then can find their place in a pluralistic democracy built on sound values like civility and human respect. Turning to the United States of America, two of the case studies was written by John Witter and Ashley Berner. They recognize the influence of school education on character formation as more overt and more visible than might be the case for other social systems like law and politics, because education is about inter alia, the shaping of character. The question of who should rule and govern the education system is an important point of contestation in the United States of America. In the political economy book, there was a whole chapter on the Constitution and the question of funding of private schools by the state in the strict separation of state and church. I will, I think, just after this session, refer to that. The reason for this is the diminished place of religion in school and universities, therefore foregoing the inherent usefulness of religious values in helping to shape the character and outlook of young people preparing to take their place in an open democratic society. With regards to the notion of pluralism in education, Robert Hefner uses the work of Charles Taylor and John Rawls on the issue of constructing overlapping consensus despite a plural outlook of values in one society. Such consensus or overlapping consensus is critical for civic coexistence and the public good. He warns against the political instrumentalization of education for narrow ideological purposes, and he defends, in his case, the contribution of Christianity towards the inculcation of genuinely civil habits of the heart, which forms part of the modern values of democratic societies. Then the last case study is on the Asian perspective. I found it very interesting to read. Chung Hong Baik discusses the impacts of the Korean education system on character formation. Baik notes that Korea places a very high value on student achievement. I just yesterday saw the results of the latest science and mathematics global survey on students' knowledge, and Korea is always amongst the top 4 or 5. He says it places a very high value on student achievement, but at the same time registers an extraordinary high level of student anxiety in the system because of this pressure, obviously, to perform. He traces the history of the Korean education system from the time of training children for aristocratic families to serve as government officials. He speaks about the impact of the Japanese annexation of Korea and the focus of anti-communism in the post-World War II period. The Korean education system is grounded in meritocracy, and the roots of the anxiety notable in the system may be explained from a culture of success and competition. And then he makes the interesting point that perhaps one should look at Confucianism, where there's an emphasis on shaping of character and the well-being of society as a whole, and not necessarily the achievement of individuals. I come to the last part of this book. It's not the last chapter, but it's about measuring moral development via psychological testing. And the earlier presentation on the moral formation of children is exactly what is discussed in this chapter. Joachim Funke's chapter on character formation from a psychological point of view might be the right point to close discussion on the education volume. He examines psychological studies of character formation and values, and specifically the attempts to measure the maturity of character or stage of moral development. He views the psychology developmental approach from Jean Piaget and later interpreted by Lawrence Kohlberg. Most of us who teach ethics in management education uses Kohlberg's idea of pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional morality based on the idea of a kind of linear development. As the brain develops from concrete to more abstract, it is possible then to make higher level moral decisions. According to Funke, moral attitudes do not develop in the same way as cognition and language, and it's a much more complex process, not particularly accessible to psychological measurement. So he's not confident that one could develop, for instance, a psychological assessment. Before you employ someone, the person does the assessment, and you can make a call on whether this person is a highly moral person or not. That seems not to be possible at the moment. If I may close, having read the book and thinking about it, I think there are 2 shortcomings in the book, which if we would have, Michael, a chance to work beyond tomorrow, I would think the question of artificial intelligence on education has been so significant and moving so fast that by the time when this book was written, it was perhaps not that much in the forefront. AI, in whatever form you want to say it, is not only relevant to education in the transmission of knowledge. That was the beginning. You simply need, during COVID, a kind of IT system, a digital system, to which you can transmit knowledge. We've now reached a stage where the creation of knowledge can be done with big databases. You can ask students to write assignments, and they produce something very quickly. And then what is crucial for education is we sit now with AI and the problem of assessment of education. So these are deep questions that will affect not only universities, but also the school systems. I then end to say the question in this book actually is, what is the ultimate purpose of education in a late modern pluralistic society? And it seems to me that the authors do agree that it's not only about transmitting of knowledge or the learning of skills, but actually the growing of attitudes and discernments so that future citizens are capable and can act with wisdom to navigate the world in all its complexity, to find zin or purpose for themselves. Thank you very much.